Good morning, good afternoon, good day, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. Welcome back to Achampnator Reads The Last Elf. This time I read chapter 18. Let's go. They worked from early morning, picking grapes, the loveliest work in the world. It was impossible for the overseers to count all the bunches on a vine, all the grapes in a bunch. They had to sing uninterruptedly to show that their mouths were empty, but it was impossible to notice when a voice was missing. The notes of "We all love the judge, and we trust him too. Grateful are we all for the judge's love," rang out constantly round the vines. The children had learned to eat in turn, only one at a time. The one who was at that moment the farthest from Fletch, who moved constantly between the rows while Slump snored down below at the foot of the slope on which the vines grew, in the shade of a fig tree. When he slept, his mouth opened, the drool began to dribble down his greyish beard, and even like that he looked less stupid than he did when he was awake. Falco and Foulpest weren't a danger, either. They were too busy trying to eat as many grapes as possible. The sun shone down on the rows. It had been a dry summer, and the grapes were perfect. In the distance, the first snow gleamed on top of the dark mountains. It was said that beyond the dark mountains was the sea, which is a kind of enormous river that never ends, and goes on and on until the horizon separates it from the sky. Robbie thought about her father, who had always told her that one day he would take her to the sea. Iomir was close to Robbie, and even she looked almost happy between one grape and another. She yelled at the top of her voice, "For the judge's love!" Then all of a sudden her face froze. She brought her hands to the mouth and nearly dropped the bunch of grapes that she was picking. Robbie watched as several emotions chased one another across Iomir's face. First, the greatest astonishment in the world. Then the greatest unhappiness in the world, followed by the greatest fear in the world, and finally the greatest horror in the world. Robbie turned to look in the same direction as Iomir and saw a shadow squatting among the rows. She immediately understood. One of Iomir's parents, or perhaps both, had come to take their daughter back, and the little girl was terrified by the idea that Flash and Slump or one of the Abaddon children might see them. You could arrive at the house of orphans either as a true orphan that is the child of dead parents, or as an Abaddon child that is the child of parents who had gone their own way, leaving the child in the care of the hyenas. This created two different factions, which were inevitably hostile toward one another. The Abaddon children were stonily accustomed to abandonment. They had somehow survived hunger and cruelty from a very tender age. Hunger and cruelty had chosen them and had become fundamental parts of their own personalities and life in general, with a consequent and inevitable hatred for anyone with memories of tenderness and abundance. They had known Flash and Slump a long time, and were almost liked by Flash and Slump, within the narrow bounds of the benevolence of which Flash and Slump were capable. The abandoned children represented by their very existence prove that the treatments dished out by the hyenas could be compatible with survival. They were, in a certain sense, the flower in the buttonhole of the house of orphans. The Abaddon children were guided by a secret dream. One day someone could come to get them. A king or a queen would knock at the door of the house of orphans to come and find their children, lost after some terrible event, swallowed up by an earthquake, swept away in a wicker basket during a flood, abducted out of pure wickedness by ogres, trolls, elves, werewolves, and the like, and then abandoned and then abandoned. Day after day, not a soul knocked at the door. In fact, there wasn't even a door on which a king or a queen or anybody at all could have knocked. There was just a sheepskin that opened to admit the hyenas and any temporary tutors who came to hire the children's labor, establishing a price with flesh while Slump looked on, sitting under a willow tree with one of the smaller children, fanning away the heat and flies. But for the Abaddon children there was always a chance, at the back of their minds, even the biggest of them, the majority lacking in the most elementary forms of innocence and trust, harbored the dream of a king and a queen who might one day appear outside their sheepskin in a gold carriage filled with good things to eat. The true orphans, on the other hand, came to the house of orphans and the care of the two hyenas without the proper preparation. The lack of preparation was made more obvious by the memories and the longing for times past. And on top of everything else, they had to deal with the hyenas, whose fundamental tasks included the obligation to erase from their young minds any feeling of affection for anything but Delagar. But in the disparate and crushed expressions of those children who had found mother and father replaced by the hyenas, and bread and cheese replaced by maize porridge with worms, hidden beneath fear and hunger, stuck between desolation and humiliation, there was also a degree of hatred. In many cases, the children had lost their parents, and not because of the ever abundant poverty, epidemics, and famine, but by a more direct intervention on the part of the judge administrator, who has no slouch when it came to the sacred punishment of death by hanging, and applied it to these people for their own good. This intensified both the hatred on the children's faces and the pale delight that the hyenas took in inflicting punishments, reducing rations, and increasing work. The sentences dished out by the judge included both hanging and exile. Those who were exiled had to leave behind their children, who were held to be the property of the county. That was what had happened to Iomir's parents, who had they ever come to take their daughter back, would have been guilty of abduction of a minor, a crime punishable by death. Like a military commander planning the strategy of battle, Robbie quickly established the position of Flesh and the most dreadful representatives of the faction of Abaddon children, principally Falco and Foulpest, and also Kala, the little girl with the missing finger, who hated Iomir with all her heart. Falco and Foulpest were far away on the other side of the vine. Flash was about halfway between Robbie and Iomir and the hidden shadow, but she was facing the higher part of the hill, where one of the smaller children had fallen, and possibly hurt hill itself, and even worse, in doing so had overturned its basket of grapes, and was now picking them back up. The danger was Kala. She was only a few feet from the crouching shadow, for fortunately she too had been distracted by the business with the tumbling child, but that wasn't going to last for much longer. Robbie thought frantically for a moment, then set off running like a mad thing as far as possible from the crouching shadow. "A snake! Help! A snake!" she began to shout as loudly as she could. "Stop that this minute and get back to work, you stupid little girl!" Flash yelled in reply. "It'll only be a grass snake." Too late. Panic had spread among the vines, or perhaps it was only an excuse to stop singing quite as much and eat more grapes. There were cries of fear, and everyone ran off in all directions, crashing into one another. Ravi went on running, pretending to be terrified, waving her hands and uttering horrified squeals. She actually did trip over a vine root and went crashing straight into one of the enormous panniers, into which the children gradually emptied their little baskets. The big pannier wobbled a few times, then crashed to the ground, where it started to roll downhill, shedding some of its contents, but not very much, in fact. when, after one last bump against a rock, it went flying and landed on top of Slump. The big pannier was practically full. Pandemonium broke out. Everyone was shouting. Flash hurried to free her companion, but the great mass of the vat lay heavily on Slump, who was trapped inside it. Falco and Foulpest ran to lend a hand, with the two of them pulling on one side, Flash on the other, and Slump in the middle, shouting inside the pannier, spraying grape juice in all directions. Among the rows, some of the children began laughing openly from the corner of her eye. Robbie glimpsed Iomir disappearing among the rows into the arms of a dark shadow. She was gone, but the problem now was Robbie. She tried desperately to come up with a way of getting out of her fix, but her mind remained blank. Slump, finally freed from the big wicker container dripping grape juice like a vat at harvest time, had got to his feet and was coming toward her. You! You! He shouted, pointing his index finger at Robbie. You! You! And his voice began to choke him. Robbie didn't have the slightest desire to know what was coming next. She wondered how much of a chance she had to try and escape. None at all. Falco and Foulpest were blocking her way. She wondered now how many blows of the cudgel she would be given, and how many times she would be removed from the line for maize porridge and an apple. For the first time, she became truly afraid. Perhaps she wouldn't make it to the spring. Robbie remained motionless, devastated. Even the tiniest trace of hope seemed to have left her. And just then, the world turned green. Robbie looked up. There was something enormous and emerald-colored in the sky, with light passing through it. Robbie was the first to figure out what was happening. The wings of a dragon had covered the sun. That was chapter 18 of The Last Elf. And with that I say, see ya in the next video. Bye.